Hi, my name is Mike. I'm one of the pastors here at Kings Harbor, and thank you so much for utilizing this resource. Our hope for you in anything that we provide is that you would expect transformation, that we could demonstrate love towards you because of the love of God demonstrated to us, that you would have the faith stirred in you to deal with obstacles and to see opportunities, and that ultimately that the kingdom of God would be revealed in every area of your life. And so our hope with this resource is that the Lord would speak to you powerfully.
If you got your Bible, go to the book of Exodus. We're going to be in chapter 7, starting in verse 14. I'll just tell you, over the next 3 weeks, we're going to be walking through the plagues that are happening in the book of Exodus. Now, some of you, as you hear that, you're like, man, that feels like it's going to be a brutal 3 weeks. But I actually think there's some beauty about what we get to see about the Lord as we walk through these texts week after week. And so as we jump in, I'm going to share a main idea that actually covers all of the plagues, but will be also specific to this week. And so here's our main idea. The 10 plagues reveal the power and patience of the Lord. God is making himself known. And what I want to do is I want to take some time and I just want to give you a bit of a primer on plagues. I don't know that you woke up this morning and say, man, I really want to think deeply about gnats. But I want to give you a bit of a primer about what we're seeing and how to read it. And then second, we're just going to walk through the first 3 plagues. And so with that in mind, I just want to jump right in and begin to think about, there's a particular question here. Why this way? Why plagues? God could do it any number of ways. In fact, if you read through the scriptures, there are other times that the Lord deals with enemy nations, and there aren't 10 plagues. There are other times where you can see this picture of God trying to redeem and rescue his people, trying to remove oppression in the world, and it doesn't seem to happen this way. In fact, the New Testament, while it speaks of the plagues, it doesn't speak about them very often because it doesn't seem to be the most normative way that the Lord works. And so why this way? And I think it may be important to talk about what the plagues are not before we talk about what the plagues are. And so here's a few points. I borrowed these and kind of metabolized them from an author named Peter Enns, but he talks about them this way. The plagues are not a geopolitical statement about how God punishes unbelieving nations. Like the reality is that there are other times where there are unbelieving nations and the Lord doesn't work this way. There are times when Israel's not believing well and the Lord would send enemy armies. And so this is not this is how the Lord always deals with those that are not believing. And I think that's important because if we're not careful, then when something happens in the world like a natural disaster, then we'll just say, well, it's the Lord punishing so-and-so. And so I think it's important to see that what the Lord's doing here is not, hey, Egypt hasn't lined up with me. They're being my enemy. I'm going to crush them in this way. The Lord doesn't always operate that way. Here's the second thing. The plagues are not a commentary on morality. This is not a lesson in how not to be Pharaoh. And the reason that that's true is because we even talked last week about the hardness of Pharaoh's heart, and that Pharaoh's hardness is not a Pharaoh problem, it's a human problem. And so if the whole point of this is don't do this lest you have gnats in your house. Well, first of all, if you live in the South, you got gnats in your house whether you love Jesus or not. So that can't be what's going on. But it seems like what the Lord is doing is something bigger than just this one person's morality. It has more to do with something that is a meta theme, not just so narrow to one person. And then here's the third thing that we need to know about plagues. Plagues are not about the giftedness or leadership of God's human partners. I think that's important on a couple of levels. One of them is, as we read this, there are going to be some questions about who's doing what. There'll be moments when Aaron's striking or Moses is stretching his hand. And I think sometimes because these are sensational type moments that we get so caught up in the details that we may miss the point that it's God working, whether it's Aaron or it's Moses. And so the answer to some of those questions don't matter as much as we want them to as Western thinkers. But here's the second part of it, and we've talked about this over and over again throughout this series, that the partners that God chooses are not because they're the most gifted people. One of the things that you'll see in the text that's really funny is, I don't know where we got the 10 plagues, because the word that is often used in the text is strike. And it's interesting because when we saw Moses try to do this in his own power, when he struck somebody, he ended up killing a dude and looking like he was starring in the movie The Fugitive. And so apparently his ability to strike isn't as faithful and true as the Lord's ability to strike. It is not about the human partners. So then why plagues? Exodus 7, verse 4 and 5, I think helped answer that question. Pharaoh will not listen to you. This is the Lord speaking. But I will put my hand into Egypt and bring the military divisions of my people, the Israelites, out of the land of Egypt by great acts of judgment. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring out the Israelites from among them. And in some ways, this is actually a direct answer to the question that Pharaoh would ask in Exodus chapter 5. In Exodus 5, Moses and Aaron go to him and said, hey, we just want you to release the people to go and worship the Lord for a 3-day journey into the wilderness. And he was like, who's the Lord? And even if I did know who the Lord is, why would I listen to him? And so what we'll begin to read as we walk through the plagues, and you're just going to see this language often, that they might know. That they might know that I'm the Lord. That they might understand that I'm the Lord. That they might know who I am. And it feels like, as much as it's the Lord dealing with an oppressive nation, as much as it is the Lord dealing with a sinful leader, as much as it is the Lord working through human agents, that ultimately the Lord's not doing the plagues because of that. The Lord's doing the plagues because he somehow wants to show us who he is. The Lord is making himself known. And so as we dive in, Exodus chapter 7, starting in verse 14, would say this. And just a word of caution this morning. We're going to be reading a lot of text. We're doing most of chapter 7 and a lot of chapter 8, so hang with me. Don't check out. Here's what it says. Then the Lord said to Moses, Pharaoh's heart is hard. He refuses to let the people go. Go to Pharaoh in the morning. When you see him walking out to the water, stand ready to meet him by the bank of the Nile. Take in your hand the staff that turned into a snake. Tell him, the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, has sent me to tell you, let my people go, so they may worship me in the wilderness. But so far you have not listened. This is what the Lord says. Here's how you will know that I am the Lord. Catch that language. Watch. I'm about to strike the water in the Nile with the staff in my hand, and it will turn to blood. The fish in the Nile will die, the river will stink, and the Egyptians will not be able to drink water from it. So the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron, take your staff and stretch your hand over the waters of Egypt, over their rivers, canals, ponds, and all their reservoirs, and they will become blood. There will be blood throughout the land of Egypt, even in wooden and stone containers. Moses and Aaron did just as the Lord had commanded in the sight of Pharaoh and his officials. He raised his staff and struck the water in the Nile, and all the water in the Nile turned to blood. The fish in the Nile died, and the river smelled so bad the Egyptians could not drink water from it. There was blood throughout the land of Egypt. But the magicians of Egypt did the same thing by their occult practices. So Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. Pharaoh turned around and went into his palace and did not take this even to heart. All the Egyptians dug around the Nile for water to drink because they could not drink the water from the river. 7 days passed after the Lord struck the Nile. Now, I want you to see a little bit about what's happening here. Like we're going to see this language over and over again. Hey, this is what I've said. I've said, will you let my people go? You've not done that. And so now I'm going to show you who I am. But it's interesting where the Lord chooses to start. Like he could pick, like there's 10 of these things. And part of me is like, why don't you just skip to the one that's going to work? Right? Like if you're thinking about disciplining your children and you're like, okay, timeouts don't work, spankings don't work, like going DEFCON 1 and like burning all your stuff is the thing that's going to work, just skip the first 2 steps. But he starts intentionally at the Nile. I think there's a couple of reasons why that maybe on first glance we don't notice. One of them, you just have to know a little bit about Egypt's relationship to the Nile. Now, I'm going to guess this. If you knew nothing this morning about Egypt other than it happened to be in the text and that you heard about it when you were in geography class in school, you probably know that the Nile is central to Egypt. But one of the things is it's not just central because it's a geographic feature. It was central to their economy, their flourishing. In fact, it was central even to the way that they worshiped. And in fact, the primary god, they had multiple gods, but one of the gods that they worshiped, one of the deities that they gave their heart over to was a god named Happy. Now, there's probably a sermon all by itself about worshiping the god of Happy, but we don't got time this morning. But Happy, this goddess, oversaw the Nile and oversaw that when the Nile flourished, the people flourished. And so it's interesting because there seems to be no other of these plagues where the Lord takes the physical force and says, take your staff and strike something. And so it's almost as if all of a sudden he strikes the Nile and all this blood comes us. It's almost as if he struck this death blow to the thing that they worship. But it's all of a sudden that this thing that you think causes your flourishing, that makes you special amongst the world, this thing that you have linked your heart to, this desire to follow Happy, I'm wounding it in such a way that you realize that there's no life in it at all. But then the second thing is, it's interesting to me that all the way back in chapter 1, when Pharaoh said, okay, I'm going to start making you work more so that way you won't flourish, and that didn't work. And then I'm going to charge these Hebrew midwives to kill your male children, and that didn't work. And then he finally says, okay, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take your male-born children and throw them into the Nile. That it is almost as if in this moment that you have looked at the Nile as this method to try and oppress and break my people, and now I'm taking that back and saying, I've got more control of it than you. It's this epic moment of God saying, the structures that you look to prove your power, to prove your strength, to prove your flourishing, like that means nothing when it stands next to me. I'm showing you who I am. And yet and still, the river becomes full of blood. The fish die. It stinks so bad that people can't drink out of it. And Pharaoh gets his magicians to do the same thing and says, I ain't worried about that. We talked last week about the two phrases, the two words for his heart being hard. And one of those words means strength in the positive, or it means this kind of rebellion in the negative, this being set in your ways. And when it says here that Pharaoh made his heart hard, it's not that he had deep resolve. It's that he was adding the second word, guilt, to his heart, that he was acting in a way that proved the guilt of who he was. And so Pharaoh, even though God has shown in his power that what you think makes you special amongst the world is nothing to me, says, but my guys can do the same thing. You ain't fazed me yet. And so I said it before, but I'll say it again. This first strike is a pointed statement against Egypt's concept of strength and power. And then we move to a second plague. Verse 1 of chapter 8 would say this. Then the Lord said to Moses, go in to Pharaoh and tell him, this is what the Lord says. Let my people go so that they may worship me. But you refuse to let them go. Then I will plague all of your territory with frogs. The Nile will swarm with frogs. They will come up and go into your palace, into your bedroom, and on your bed, and into the houses of your officials and your people, and into your ovens and kneading bowls. The frogs will come up on you, your people, and all of your officials. The Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron, stretch out your hand with your staff over the river, canals, ponds, and cause the frogs to come up into the land of Egypt. When Aaron stretched out his hand over the waters of Egypt, the frogs came up and covered the land of Egypt. But the magicians did the same thing by their occult practices and brought frogs up onto the land of Egypt. Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, appeal to the Lord to remove the frogs from me and my people. Then I will let the people go, and they can sacrifice to the Lord. Moses said to Pharaoh, you may have the honor of choosing When should I appeal on behalf of you, your officials, and your people, that the frogs be taken away from you and your houses and remain only in the Nile? Tomorrow, he answered. And you paused and were like, why? Why not right now? I actually don't know. Moses replied, as you have said, so that you may know that there is no one like the Lord. Hear that language again. The frogs will go away from you, your houses, your officials, and your people. The frogs will remain only in the Nile. After Moses and Aaron went out from Pharaoh, Moses cried out to the Lord for help concerning the frogs that he had brought against Pharaoh. The Lord did as Moses said. The frogs in the houses, courtyards, and fields died. They piled them up in countless heaps, and there was a terrible odor in the land. But when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart and would not listen to them, as the Lord had said. Now, as you think through this, I think there's some of the same dynamic of understanding the Egyptian culture to understand part of why this was an effective strike from the Lord. In the pantheon of Egyptian gods, there was a god named Heket, and Heket was the god of multiplication and fruitfulness. And if you ever saw a picture of the god Heket, the face of Heket was a frog. And so when they wanted to multiply in business, when they wanted to multiply in childbearing, when they wanted to multiply in all of these ways, they looked to this frog-headed deity and said, you're going to bring flourishing for us. And so it's interesting that the Lord's like, oh, you want to look at frogs to multiply? I got you. And so the language of the writer is trying to let you feel the comprehensive, oppressive nature of how many frogs there were. Not that there's just frogs coming out of the water, but frogs in your bedroom. But not just frogs in your bedroom, but frogs in your bed. Not just frogs in your bed, but frogs in your oven, frogs in your kneading bowls. Frogs are going to be on you. Like there's this sense of everywhere you go, everywhere you look, like this isn't going to kill anybody, but it's going to make your day difficult. And so what I don't understand is with this multiplication of frogs all over Egypt, Pharaoh says to his magicians, hey, can you guys do the same thing? And then they bring more frogs. Like, I don't know why you would make the problem worse for yourself, but they did. And somehow, this causes Pharaoh to be like, now it's too much. And so he says to Moses, appeal to the Lord, appeal to your God, ask him to remove these frogs, and then I'll let your people go. Now, I think the way that we read the translation, I think they translate it kindly because it says that Moses would say to him, you have the honor of choosing. I think a more exact translation would be, I'm giving you the advantage. It would be like if you were playing one-on-one basketball, you'd be like, hey, I'm going to give you the ball. I'm going to say you can be up 10-0. We're going to play to 11. Let's go. Like Moses is not like, Pharaoh, like, I just want to give you some honor, dude. Like, I think he's actually saying, to prove to you how faithful and powerful God is, I'm going to let you name the time so that way there's no doubt in your mind that God is in control of this. And what I don't understand is why he's not like, this very second. Now, some translations would say by the morning. Others would say tomorrow. But either way, that feels like, look, I don't know how y'all feel about frogs. But I'm going to tell you, they don't even have to get in the bedroom or just get them on the land croaking and I'm done. And so the fact that he was like, take your time, go pray, do it by the morning, makes zero sense to me. Unless, in some way, even in this, his heart's still not moved. Unless in some way, even though he's feigning that he's going to do the right thing, that he's going to let the people go, and then we see that the text would tell us explicitly that once he sees relief, that it says that Pharaoh again made his heart guilty. He hardened his heart again, that there's something in him that once the imminent pressure of the plague was gone, the strike was removed, that all of a sudden he feels good enough that he's like, no, I don't need to do this. I also love that the Lord is like, all right, I'm not going to bring any more live frogs, but y'all going to have to clean up this mess yourselves. And we see the Lord showing his power, and somehow it doesn't just show the power of God, but it begins to show the truth of Pharaoh's heart. This second plague reveals the increasing guilt of Pharaoh's heart. Like at what point, what's it going to take? 7 days and your people had to go out of their way to dig to get water, and that didn't bother you enough. Like you couldn't even be concerned with that. Frogs all over the place, and you're so tone deaf to what's happening to the people around you that you are literally asking your magicians not to remove the frogs, but show that they can create the same problem. That the depth of the guilt of Pharaoh's heart should not lead us to be a little bit jostled when it says later on that the Lord would harden Pharaoh's heart, because the Lord wasn't making Pharaoh's heart something that it wasn't. It's very clear that there's wickedness and guilt in this man's heart, so much so that he seems not to be concerned for his people, concerned for their welfare, concerned for anything other than proving himself to try and be the equal of God. And I imagine that even in his deceived, deluded mind, the fact that he got to negotiate when it was going to happen proved to him how strong he was. This second strike and the subsequent ones will continue to reveal the increasing guilt of Pharaoh's heart. And then the third plague. Verse 16 would say, "Then the Lord said to Moses, 'Tell Aaron, stretch out your staff and strike the dust of the land, and it will become gnats throughout the land of Egypt.' And they did this. Aaron stretched out his hand with his staff, and when he struck the dust of the land, gnats were on people and animals. All the dust of the land became gnats throughout the land of Egypt. The magicians tried to produce gnats using their occult practices, but they could not. The gnats remained on people and animals. 'This is the finger of God,' the magicians said to Pharaoh. But Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he would not listen to them, as the Lord had said." And I think there's a couple of things here that are maybe important to slow down and talk about. One of them is the reality that all along the way, when it was the snakes, when it was the water being turned to blood, when it was the frogs, that the magicians were able to reproduce it. And that doesn't sit well with our theological paradigm. Because for some of us, the supernatural is kind of weird anyways, and we wish we would skip these chapters. But to think that something evil was trying to imitate and replicate what God was doing, like there's supposed to be none beside him. And so how are these two things happening at the same time? And there's a real conversation that there is a real spiritual darkness that we face and deal with that can mimic and produce supernatural things, but it's quick to show that even those have their limit. That 2 plagues into 10, they're not able to keep up. That if this was a baseball game, 3 pitches in, they struck out and like, I think we should just go home. That there's a limit to this flawed, fake version of power that they're leaning into that doesn't match the power of God. But then here's the second thing that I think is really important, and you'll actually begin to see this as we walk through the first 9 plagues. There's a rhythm, there's a pattern here. The first plague, the Lord will tell Moses, Aaron, go stand somewhere, wait on Pharaoh in the morning. He'll tell you what time of day. They give a forewarning, explain what's happening, and they get to see this. They get to say, here's what's going to come. The second one, it doesn't necessarily give you a time of day, but it goes, go straight to Pharaoh, tell him this is what's coming. There is a forewarning. And then it's interesting, after he shows the wickedness of his heart, the Lord doesn't give a forewarning, doesn't give a time of day. There is no conversation. The Lord just begins to show his power. And it's interesting because there's no, there's a limit of time that the water's bad. There's a limit of time that eventually the frogs are dead and have to be piled and scooped up. But there seems to be no limit of time about how long these gnats are bothering people. That this feels like the mercy of God is lessening in the situation to grab Pharaoh's attention, and yet and still it says that Pharaoh's heart was hard and he did not listen. It feels, if we ask the question, why these plagues? It feels like it's showing both the power of God and the patience of God, but it's also showing that it's going to take much more than what's happened so far to get Pharaoh's attention enough that he would relent and let the people of God go. So what do we do with this? This doesn't feel really directly applicable. Doesn't feel like tomorrow while you're on your way to work and you're trapped on the 405 that you're gonna be like, Lord, if you would just send gnats into that car that's driving slow in the fast lane. I don't think he's gonna do that for you. I mean, you can pray it all you want. So it doesn't feel like this is a how-to manual of in your life when facing conflict, here's how you hold the staff to turn gnats into dust. It also doesn't feel in this way because it feels like other than Moses and Aaron doing what God commanded them to do, it doesn't feel like there's much command for it. We don't even really see what Israel's doing. In fact, there's a lot of debate. Is Israel experiencing this also, or are they just protected as they're in Goshen? Like, we actually don't even really know. Like, they're kind of bystanders, but we don't know how they're interacting with this. So it doesn't feel like this is meant to show us something that we should do or how we should respond. It feels like it's saying something outside of us about who God is and how we ought to know him. So again, if the main idea is that the 10 plagues reveal the power and the patience of the Lord and that God is making himself known, how does that land with us? Here's the first thing that I want you to know. The God of Exodus invites us into a deeper, richer faith than we may have known. Like, even think about the context of the entire book. So far, we've heard God sending Moses and Aaron to do some things, to have some conversations, to try and appeal, to even show that they can turn a staff into a serpent, into this sea creature, sea monster that points to creation. But at this point, we haven't seen God actively do very much. And then in these few verses, the Lord begins to move in a way that only he can get the credit. He begins to move in a way that, like, this has to be the Lord. And it's something that is supernatural and mind-boggling. And I just don't want to miss the magnitude of what's happening. When I was studying this week, there are lots of smart people, smarter than me, that are arguing about, well, is this something that's actually supernatural, or they came up with this term hypernatural, that it's something that naturally happens, but the Lord was using it, or maybe it was just the natural occurrence of things. This is some people would debate as far as to say, well, you know that if the Nile flooded at the right time and the white Nile and the blue Nile, which I didn't know that there was Niles that had multiple colors, the white Nile and the blue Nile, if they flooded at the same time and hit the main tributary of the Nile, that all of a sudden that all the dirt would come up and it would be red dirt and there would be bacteria in it that would cause the fish to die. And so like they're building this really scientific argument. Let me just tell you, I barely made it through geography in college, so I have no idea if they're right or wrong. Or some would say that something like that happened, and when the river became so toxic, it's the reason all the frogs jumped out. When all the frogs died, that's the reason that the gnats showed up, and they would build this causality from one to the next, except for I don't know what causes hail. But let's just say they're right. Does that steal the power of God to take something natural and use it for his purposes to prove the power of who he is? Like, does it change the fact that the God of creation says that I can bend creation whatever I want to, whenever I want to achieve my purposes? Like, I didn't talk about it much this morning. I'll talk about it here in a couple of weeks, that this is God pulling back the boundaries of creation. This is a moment of decreation where he says, I'm exposing how broken creation is, and I'm doing it through pulling back the common grace of the world working the way that it should. Does it strip God of his power if he chooses to use natural means to pursue the heart of a wicked king to try and get him to relent? But I'm going to beg to tell you that something more than the natural is going on here. And I know that we're modern and we're enlightened, and that's fine and good. I know that we've watched Prince of Egypt since we were 15. Maybe you're younger than me. Maybe you've been watching it since you were 3. But I know you've been watching it, so I know that these don't seem all that miraculous to you. But the fact that God, at a whim, could say, I'm going to take the most powerful body of water in that part of the world, and when I say so, the God that you worship that's represented by that river, I'm going to give it a mortal blow that makes it bleed. That I'm going to have frogs just invade every part of your world just because I can. That I'm going to take dust and turn them into gnats. And so that way there's not a place in your world that you won't be bothered by the fact that I have control over this and you've rebelled against me. Like, I just don't want to miss the Lord's power. I'm in a season of life where I'm spending a lot of time at youth basketball. My 5-year-old's playing, and so I get to be coach dad, even though I'm not a coach. I'm like sideline dad that's like yelling out plays that shouldn't yell out plays. And like there's this thing going on in basketball right now where when players want to celebrate, they'll do this thing, and if you're in the back, I'm sorry that you can't see, but they'll like point down at the ground, and it's basically saying like whoever's defending me is too small. And I don't know where it started, but NBA players started doing it, college players started doing it. And I imagine all of a sudden we're gonna have a bunch of like kindergarten and first grade kids, they're gonna like score a layup. Like the one kid that can actually score is gonna be like too small. I'm like, you're all too small. You're like 3.5 feet tall. And it's this recognition that if you knew how good I was, you would send somebody better than that, somebody bigger than that. I wonder if there's moments with the way that we look at the God who is the creator of the universe that has no other God standing next to him, if he sometimes says, man, you're just looking at me like I'm too small. That your trust in me is too small, that your belief in me is too small. And not that the Lord despises small faith, because it only takes a mustard seed for the Lord to move. But sometimes I wonder if we even have that. I wonder if the Lord's saying, I want you to trust me bigger and believe me bigger, that I can work with just about anything. Give me some water and I can turn it to blood. Give me some frogs and I can cause them to be an invading army. Give me some dust and I can make it an army of gnats, that I can work with what you got. Can you trust me with a bigger faith than what you got? When I was in Dallas, I was a young adult pastor, and we were getting ready to go on a mission trip to Brazil. And we were flying into Sao Paulo, but the place that we were going was 7 hours away. And so like 2 or 3 days before we left, our contact there said, hey, you guys need about $500 more each to fly into the actual city where the church that you're going to be serving is. And there were a bunch of broke college kids with their broke college pastor. Nobody was coming up with $500 each in the next few days. Now, at the time, one of the guys on staff, his name was Taylor, had a little girl, I believe she was 8 at the time. Her name was Caroline. And that summer, Caroline decided that she was going to be my assistant, meaning she was going to take over my office and play with my computer while I didn't get anything done. And so that day in particular, Caroline decided she didn't want to be in my office, that she wanted to practice leading worship. Apparently, she was just taking over the church. For giving her another week, she would have been preaching on Sunday. And so she figured out how to get the sound system on and was on the stage yelling as loud as she could on repeat the Chris Tomlin song, Our God is Greater. And so like over and over again, she's singing, our God is greater, our God is stronger, God, you are higher than any other. Like to the degree that somebody was like, Mike, go get Caroline off the stage because she just keeps singing the song. And so I'm annoyed, the rest of the staff's annoyed. I walk in there and I'm getting ready to be like, sweetheart, you can't keep doing that. And the Lord was like, she's got a bigger faith than yours. Because she's singing about how much bigger and greater and stronger than I am, and you're trying to figure out with your measly means how you're gonna try and get $500 more for each person that's going on the trip. And if you could pause long enough to believe me like she could, you might see me move. And I just wonder if far too often our faith is too small. If far too often we just don't trust that the Lord can work with what he's got. I say that because some of you are going to jump on a bus this afternoon and drive down to be spending time with kids whose worlds have been a wreck. And as good as the program is, and you guys have put a lot of work, at the end of the day, if the faith is too small, we won't believe that the Lord can transform the life of those kids. That in just a few days, some of you are going to jump on an airplane and fly over to the Philippines, and we're going to serve and we're going to love. But if our faith is too small, we're not going to believe that the Lord can transform the destiny of families because our God is that big. For some of you, you'll leave Sunday morning where you can hold it together for 90-ish minutes and go home and say, I heard stuff that was good, but I don't believe the Lord can save my kids or transform my marriage or minister me in my brokenness and my singleness. And the Lord is saying, do you not know who I am? Everything that I do displays my power. Here's the second thing that I want you to know. The power of God is matched by his perfect patience. I said this before, but I'll say it again. It feels like if the Lord knew that it was going to take 10 plagues to get Pharaoh's heart to change, he should have just started with number 10. But could it be possible that it's the Lord's patience that's driving the methodology? The river turning to blood had to be awful, and yet it didn't kill anybody. In fact, they could dig around the river and they could find water. Frogs everywhere. I'm just telling you, if I was Pharaoh, I'd be done on that plague. Lord could have whatever he wanted. As awful as it was, it didn't kill anybody. Gnats all over with seemingly no end date of when that's happening. Awful. And for whatever reason, it feels like the Lord could have been more extreme in his judgment. And is it the mercy of God to deconstruct the faulty belief of Egypt and say that none of this is going to ultimately give you what you want, that you need to turn towards me, but yet in his mercy, he didn't completely destroy them? And I'll just tell you that in my life, here's where I struggle. I either don't believe in the power of God enough or I don't like the pace in which he's doing it. Like if you would just hurry up, Lord, and if I knew what he knew, I would trust his patience. I mean, isn't this what Peter would say to a bunch of exiles when he's talking about eternity? And he would say to them, and yet and still, as powerful as God is, you need to know that a day is like 1,000 years to the Lord and 1,000 years is like a day. He's not working on your timetable. He's not on your deadline like, Lord, if you don't move by 5 o'clock. And then he would say, and yet the Lord is doing what he does because he is so perfectly patient that none would perish. That even for some of us in this room to know the patience of God who has flexed his power in a way that it leaves no doubt that he could do whatever he needs to do when he needs to do it, that he would be patient enough in the severe mercies of proving that these things don't satisfy, to say, I have something better. Will you look to me and trust me? And maybe the wrestle is not that we don't believe in his power, but that we're not patient enough to wait on it. And my prayer for me and my prayer for you, look, I am less and less a young man, but I still got young man's disease. I think everything should happen faster than what it does. And what if the Lord's like, but my timing's better. I'm revealing to you my patience that you would keep in step with me. So I want to invite you to wrestle this week. Maybe you struggle with the Lord's power. Maybe you've believed really small. Maybe he's this nice boxed in God that gets songs sung about him on Sunday to lift his spirits up, and then you'll come see him again next week, but you've just made him really small. I'm gonna give you some homework. I just want to invite you to read Isaiah chapter 40. Isaiah chapter 40 would say things about God like he sits on the circle of the earth, that he stretches the sky like a tent, that he holds the mountains in a balance and the hills on a scale, and the islands of the sea are but a small thing for him. And whenever I'm in a season of life that I begin to see God as being small, I begin to read that chapter and begin to pray that prayer. Like there are some of you in this room with some of the situations that you've had, that's the prayer that I pray. That I pray that, Lord, if you could hold the mountains in a balance and the hills on a scale, then restoring this family is but a small thing to you. And maybe just being reminded of the bigness of our God causes us to live with this expectant, courageous, responsive, kingdom-revealing faith that says, I just believe that you can. Yeah. And then I also want to give you some homework this week. Maybe if you're discouraged with the patience of the Lord, to just slow down and read Psalm 13. Psalm 13 is the gritty psalm that gives you permission to be like, I'm not patient enough for you to do this the way that you're doing it. How long, O Lord? And here's what he'll do. He'll respond to you with patience. He won't zap you and be like, how dare you question my timing? He will show you his loving kindness and patience by walking with you in the midst of it. So let me pray as we end our time in the Word together. Lord, thank you for this text and the two subsequent texts to come about the cycle of the 9 plagues. And Lord, I realize for the person sitting and listening that it feels like the call is not as tangible as it might be if it were to say, hey, after you read the text, examine your heart and see if there's ways that it's hard. Or after you read the text, see if there's ways that you can practically be a faithful presence in the world around you. But Lord, I think that this is such an important moment for us, because if we see you wrongly, then the rest of what we do is going to be off. This is the 1 degree or the 1 pixel off that if we miss this, that it distorts the entire picture. It ruins the entire trajectory. And so, Lord, to give us eyes to see you in the bigness and the fullness of who you are, giving us eyes to see that you're working at a pace that reveals something about who you are in our hearts, that, Lord, when you do that, you show us a way of knowing you that it goes far beyond maybe the surface that we've been comfortable with. And so, Lord, will you reveal to us a deeper and richer faith that is forged by the patience that you perfectly display? Where we struggle, would you remind us through your word? Where we feel like our faith is faltering, would you, by your Spirit, breathe new life into us? Our faith, though small, is big enough to believe that you can. It's in your matchless name I pray. Amen.
Thanks so much for checking out this message from Kings Harbor. We would love to connect with you. If you go to kingsharbor.org/hello and fill out a short connect card, that allows us the opportunity to follow up with you. Also, if this message has been a blessing to your life, we believe that the Lord wants to rule and reign in every part of who we are. That means our time, our talent, our treasure. And so if this has been a blessing, we would ask that you would consider contributing back to the ministries of Kings Harbor so we can continue to bless and help people in the same way that we hope we have done for you. With that in mind, we want you to know that our heart towards you and our heart towards the world around us is that we want to be a love-forward people. And we're praying that you would join us in that.